In October of 2018, Detective Aaron Whitlock stood alone in a county records room that hadn't been reorganized since the late 1980s. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds, as if even the building itself was tired of remembering. Dust coated the filing cabinets. Cardboard boxes sat stacked against the walls, their labels faded to the point of illegibility. Whitlock hadn't planned to be there that night. He had been reviewing an unrelated cold case when a clerk mentioned an old incident, barely a footnote in the department's archives, about a group of hikers who vanished in 1975. No suspects. No remains. No resolution. Just a thin folder marked closed, presumed lost. That word bothered him. Lost implied accident. It implied nature. It implied nobody was to blame. Today's story is one of those stories that will keep you thinking on what must have happened that day of their disappearance. But before we head into it, please make sure you support the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next case just like this one. Whitlock pulled the box down from the shelf and carried it to a long table near the back. Inside were brittle reports, black and white photographs, and a folded topographic map yellowed with age. As he began reading, a strange pattern emerged, one that hadn't been noticed back then, or maybe had been ignored. The hikers hadn't been a single group. They were individuals who disappeared within a 4-month span, all in the same mountainous region bordering a dense national forest. Some went missing alone. Others in pairs. Their ages ranged from 18 to 22. All white. All recently out of high school or just past it. All described as physically healthy. And all of them vanished without leaving behind gear, campsites, or signs of struggle. The original investigation had treated each disappearance as unrelated. Weather. Terrain. Poor preparation. A bad decade for safety standards. But Whitlock noticed something else. Each missing person had been last seen within a few miles of an abandoned state facility that once operated deep in the forested hills, a place that, according to a single paragraph in the file, had been quietly shut down in the early 1980s and later demolished. No name was given. No follow-up either. Whitlock leaned back in his chair, staring at the map. A thin red pencil line circled a ridge system riddled with caves, most unmapped, some collapsed. One marking in particular stood out. Not because it was labeled, but because it wasn't. A blank space. He photographed the map with his phone and shut the box. 3 weeks later, 2 amateur cave explorers entered that same ridge system. They weren't looking for history. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking for airflow, something cavers chase instinctively. A breeze where there shouldn't be one often means an undiscovered passage. They found it near dusk. Hidden behind a curtain of vines and loose stone was a narrow cave opening, partially sealed with concrete. Time had cracked it open just enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Their headlamps cut through thick dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. About 40 feet in, the natural cave walls gave way to something unmistakably man-made. Straight edges. Reinforced beams. Old electrical conduit rusted into the stone. And then, a tunnel. The passage sloped downward, reinforced with concrete and metal supports. Faded numbers were painted along the walls, some scratched out, others partially visible. The air grew stale. Heavy. At the end of the tunnel was an iron door. It was locked. When authorities were notified the following morning, Detective Whitlock was the first to arrive. The door took less than 5 minutes to breach. What waited on the other side would reopen a case that had been buried for 43 years. The chamber beyond the door wasn't a cave. It was a room. Concrete floor. Drain in the center. hooks embedded in the ceiling. Along the far wall, stacked neatly against one another, were human remains, skeletons arranged deliberately, as if whoever put them there wanted them counted. There were 17 of them. Initial forensic estimates placed the victims' ages between 18 and 23. Some were barely adults. Others had lived just long enough to start imagining a future. All had been dead for decades. Among the bones were personal items, belt buckles, worn shoes, fragments of denim, a cracked watch frozen at a time no one bothered to reset. And then there were the letters. Folded carefully. Some sealed. None mailed. They were written in youthful handwriting. Awkward phrasing. Optimistic language. Promises to come home soon. Apologies for not calling. Mentions of progress. Mentions of treatment. One letter mentioned turning 19 soon. Another talked about being allowed outside again. None of the letters had addresses written on the envelopes. None had stamps. It became clear very quickly that these people had not died in the wilderness. They had been kept. As the chamber was documented and sealed, Whitlock returned to the archives. This time, he knew what he was looking for. The unnamed facility. He found it buried under budget documents, health department memos, and funding records that extended far beyond the building's closure. On paper, the place had continued operating long after it was supposedly shut down. Government funds had continued flowing. Per patient funding. For residents who, according to the cave, had never left. The facility had housed young adults who had recently aged out of state care, many of them 18, some older, all without strong family oversight. They were sent there for rehabilitation, evaluation, or transitional housing. Officially, no deaths were recorded. No disappearances acknowledged. When residents stopped writing home, the silence was blamed on progress, on treatment, on independence. No one questioned it. And when hikers began vanishing nearby in 1975, young people, alone, vulnerable, easy to redirect, the connection was missed. Or ignored. By December 2018, forensic teams had matched several of the skeletons to missing hikers from that year. Not all of them. Some of the remains belonged to people who had never been reported missing at all. As families were contacted, a pattern emerged that made Whitlock's stomach sink. Each victim had last been heard from after entering the forest. Each had mentioned being approached by someone offering help. And each had believed they were walking toward safety. The public would soon learn about the cave. But one question still had no answer. Who built the tunnel, and why did it take more than 40 years for anyone to follow it? And more importantly, how many people knew it was there the entire time? By early 2019, the cave had become the center of a growing storm. News helicopters hovered over the forested ridge. Temporary fencing went up. Reporters camped near the access road, all asking the same question. How could 17 people vanish and no one notice for more than 4 decades? Detective Whitlock ignored the noise. What mattered to him was paper. Records. The kind of evidence that didn't rot away underground. He started with the facility. It had been known locally as a rehabilitation and transition center, though its official name barely appeared anywhere anymore. The buildings had been demolished in 1983, replaced by nothing but uneven ground and regrown forest. No plaque. No memorial. Just a widened clearing where concrete foundations still slept beneath the soil. According to surviving state documents, the center accepted residents between the ages of 18 and 23. Most had come directly from foster care or juvenile programs. Some were sent for mental health treatment. Others for addiction counseling. a few for reasons that were never fully explained. What they all had in common was isolation. No immediate family nearby. No one checking in weekly. No legal advocate assigned to them once they turned 18. Perfectly invisible. Staff rosters were incomplete. Names appeared and disappeared from payrolls without explanation. Oversight reports were vague, stamped compliant year after year with identical language. The same phrases. The same signatures. And the same funding. Whitlock noticed that even after the facility officially closed, money kept coming. Quarterly disbursements. Per-resident allocations. Housing grants. Care stipends. For people who, on paper, were still alive. But underground, they were not. Forensic reports painted a grim picture. Several skeletons showed signs of repeated blunt force trauma. Others had fractures that had healed improperly, suggesting long-term neglect. Teeth showed advanced decay inconsistent with access to medical care. Bone density suggested chronic malnutrition. These weren't hikers who got lost. They were captives. The letters deepened that conclusion. Most were dated between 1974 and 1979. A few were earlier. Handwriting analysis suggested they had been written over extended periods, not all at once. Some victims wrote multiple letters, each one slightly less hopeful than the last. One 18-year-old wrote about being told he would be allowed to leave soon if he kept cooperating. Another, age 21, apologized to her parents for failing again and promised she was getting stronger. Several letters mentioned being moved underground during renovations. None of the letters were ever sent. Investigators concluded they had been confiscated, stored, and later dumped with the bodies, possibly as an afterthought. Or a mistake. As families were notified, the grief came in waves. Some parents had died never knowing what happened to their children. Others had spent decades blaming themselves for letting them go hiking alone. One mother collapsed when told her son's remains had been found less than 10 miles from where she still lived. The official story in 1975 had been simple. Dangerous terrain, poor visibility, inexperienced hikers. Now that story unraveled. Whitlock traced the tunnel's path. Old blueprints revealed it connected directly to the facility's lowest basement level. Officially, it was listed as a storm shelter and storage corridor. Unofficially, it led somewhere no one was meant to see. Why hide bodies there? The answer came from a retired state auditor who agreed to speak off the record. Funding for the center had been tied to occupancy. The more residents listed, the more money flowed. Discharging residents reduced funding. Reporting deaths triggered investigations. But if a resident simply disappeared? No paperwork required. And if the missing were hikers, outsiders with no official tie to the facility? They didn't affect the numbers at all. The implication was chilling. Someone had been replacing lost residents with new ones. People who would never be missed immediately. People whose disappearance could be blamed on the wilderness. The timeline fit too well to ignore. The first hikers vanished shortly after the facility began experiencing budget scrutiny. The disappearances stopped once the center shut down. Whoever was responsible had adapted to pressure. They had known exactly how to hide. Whitlock requested interviews with former employees. Most were deceased. Others claimed memory loss. A few refused outright. One former maintenance worker, now in his late 70s, admitted something unsettling. He remembered being told not to enter certain areas of the basement. He remembered late-night transports. He remembered concrete being poured underground long after the facility claimed to be winding down. But he said he never asked questions. Fear kept him quiet then. Time kept him quiet now. The official list of suspects remained empty. The facility's director had died years earlier. Several administrators followed. Paper trails ended conveniently. No single living person could be charged without direct evidence tying them to the deaths. And yet, someone had ordered the tunnel built. Someone had authorized the locks. Someone had decided who went underground, and who never came back. As spring turned to summer in 2019, excavation expanded. More chambers were searched. No additional remains were found. 17 skeletons. But Whitlock wasn't convinced that number told the whole story. One detail kept him awake at night. Only 13 of the 17 skeletons matched known missing hikers. The other 4. They didn't exist in any missing persons database. No reports. No photos. No families coming forward. Just bones. Which meant some of the victims had never even been counted as lost. They had been erased before they disappeared. And if that was true, then the cave wasn't just a burial site. It was a filter, separating those who would be searched for from those who never would. The case went cold again by the end of the year. Public interest faded. Funding dried up. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, it stalled. But before Whitlock boxed the files for storage, a lab report crossed his desk. One of the skeletons showed something unusual embedded in the bone. Not rock. Not metal. Plastic. Modern plastic. Meaning at least one body had been placed there much later than anyone thought. Decades later. Long after the facility was supposed to be gone. Which meant someone had gone back. And whatever they were hiding might not be finished yet. The plastic fragment changed everything. Until that moment, investigators had been operating under a single grim assumption. Whatever happened in the tunnel ended decades ago. The perpetrators were dead. The system collapsed. Justice, while incomplete, had reached its natural limit. But plastic didn't belong to the 1970s chamber. Laboratory analysis confirmed it within days. The fragment was part of a disposable glove liner, manufactured no earlier than the mid-1990s. It had been embedded in bone fractures that occurred after death, meaning the skeleton had been handled, repositioned, or disturbed long after the individual had already died. Someone had been inside the chamber. Long after the facility closed. Long after the tunnel should have been forgotten. Long after the forest had reclaimed everything above it. Detective Whitlock reopened excavation permits immediately, but what followed was a quiet resistance that never made headlines. Requests for expanded searches were delayed. Funding approvals stalled. Jurisdiction was questioned. Liability concerns were raised. It felt familiar. The same slow suffocation that had buried the case the first time. When teams finally returned underground, they found signs of intrusion, subtle but undeniable. Fresh boot impressions in dust layers that should have remained undisturbed. A section of wall where concrete had been chipped away and poorly patched. A metal hook removed from the ceiling and replaced with a newer bolt. Nothing stolen. Nothing added. Just adjusted. Almost as if someone had come back to check. Whitlock began to wonder if the cave had ever truly been abandoned. The financial investigation offered no comfort. A forensic accountant confirmed that government funding tied to the facility's former residents continued to be dispersed well into the late 1990s, long after all official oversight ended. The accounts were eventually closed, but not flagged. The money didn't disappear. It moved. Through shell properties. Through trusts. Through inheritances. No single beneficiary could be identified. Just a network that dissolved neatly once it was no longer needed. When Whitlock re-examined the victims' profiles, another chilling consistency surfaced. Several of the hikers who vanished in 1975 had backgrounds that mirrored the facility's original residents. Foster care histories, juvenile placements, temporary housing, young adults recently unmoored from oversight. They weren't random. They were replacements. People who could be redirected, convinced, coerced. People who could be told help was nearby. Shelter, treatment, work, safety. The letters made that painfully clear. One unsent note mentioned being led through a back way to avoid paperwork. Another described being told the underground space was temporary, just until things settled upstairs. None of the victims ever expressed fear of a stranger. They trusted whoever brought them there. That trust haunted Whitlock more than the bones. In late 2020, DNA testing finally identified the 4 unknown skeletons. Their names had never appeared in missing persons databases because no one had reported them missing. They were former residents of state systems who aged out, drifted, and vanished quietly. They had been invisible long before they died. Families were notified where possible. In 2 cases, there was no next of kin to contact at all. The official count remained 17. Unofficially, Whitlock suspected more. The tunnel was long. Too long for one chamber. Ground-penetrating radar suggested voids beyond collapsed sections of rock, areas never excavated due to instability and lack of funding. When Whitlock pushed for further exploration, the request was denied. Again. The case report was finalized in 2021. Cause of death: homicide. Manner: undetermined. Suspects: none. Status: open. No arrests were made. No indictments filed. No names officially blamed. The cave was resealed under federal authority, its location classified to prevent trespassing. The forest returned to silence. But Whitlock never stopped thinking about the plastic. About the idea that someone, somewhere, knew exactly where that tunnel was. And might still know. In his final memo before retirement, Whitlock wrote a single line that never made it into the public report. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a system that adapted. And systems don't disappear, they evolve. To this day, no one has come forward to explain who authorized the tunnel, who selected the victims, or who returned years later to disturb the remains. No whistleblower. No confession. Just 17 skeletons beneath a mountain, and the knowledge that they weren't lost. They were hidden. And if that cave had never cracked open in 2018, the truth would still be buried, untouched, undiscovered, and perfectly quiet. Now the real question that still bothers family and friends of the victims up till this day is this. Was all of this just a tragic accident, or was someone hiding a terrible secret for decades? We may never know the full truth. Let me know what you think happened in the comments below. And if you want more chilling, real-life mysteries uncovered, make sure to support the channel and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.